Welcome, everybody. I know it takes a few moments for everybody to get into the room, so to speak, but while you do, I just want to welcome you to today's presentation, Moths in Our Midst, What They Do and Why It Matters, with our very special guest, Dr. Christian Schmidt. And while people are sort of joining in, I thought I'll just go through a bit of housekeeping and say that it's great if you want to put in the chat where you're from. It's always fun to see where we're all joining from across this country. And remember, when you're doing that, to choose to everyone, not just to host and panelists, because if you don't do that, only Christian and I will see it. So I am Sarah Koolber. I'm with CWF's Gardening for Wildlife program, and I'm currently, right now, coming from our headquarters in Canada, Ontario. And I see, okay, people are starting to put in the chat. Let's see, Ontario, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan. Oh, this is great already, lovely. Ontario, Muskoka, Manitoba, Manitoulin Island. Oh my goodness, Vermont, I think I saw. Very cool. For BC, oh, I love it. Okay, well, you guys keep doing that, please. I'll just get on to the next point, which is if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, because at the very end of the webinar, I will then go through them and ask questions, and we can find them all in one spot. If you put them in the chat, it's harder for me to find them. So please, questions in the Q&A. This will be recorded. There will be a replay link that you get in a follow-up email afterwards that Zoom will send out once I've finished creating it, that is. So I think that's all for the basics, and it looks like the numbers are steadying off now. So I think I'll just get started and keep us on time. So as mentioned, I'm Sarah Koolber with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and I'm really happy that you guys are joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and I respect the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land. And it's always a very cool connection with the Gardening for Wildlife program, which I'm with, because here we are trying to be wise stewards of our corner of the country and live in harmony with our wild neighbors. And the First Nations people have been doing that for eons, you know, loving, respecting, nurturing Mother Nature and all its creatures, all its inhabitants, all its elements. So a nice connection there. But now I'd like to introduce our speaker. And I heard from a colleague that actually Christian is one of the leading taxonomists of Lepidoptera and one of our Canada's biggest moth experts. So I'm really extra excited that Christian's agreed to do this talk for us. So Dr. Christian Schmidt has been fascinated by moths and butterflies since childhood. His formative years were spent chasing insects in the grasslands and mountains of Western Canada, which sounds absolutely heavenly to me. And for the past 18 years, he has worked as a research scientist at the Canadian National Collection of Insects in Ottawa with the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. His research focuses on taxonomy, systematics, and faunistics of North American moths, basically what species are found where, how to identify them, their evolutionary relationships, and describing species new to science. He is also interested in insect conservation and served on what we call COSEWIC, the Committee of the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And his education background includes insect systematics and evolution, getting his doctorate at the University of Alberta, insect ecology with his master's, also at University of Alberta, and terrestrial ecology for his bachelor's at the University of Calgary. His scientific publications are found at a link that I'm going to include in the follow-up email, so you can access them afterwards if that interests you. And bringing it down relevant to our Gardening for Wildlife program, he also has a personal interest in native plant gardening and other urban practices that increase insect biodiversity. So I'm really excited that Christian's here to speak with us on this subject. And I'm so thrilled to see so many people registered for this, because it really shows that the interest in this topic is there. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to hand it over to Christian. And when you're ready, I will mute myself as well.
Okay.
And thanks everybody, people who are newly joining in, to say where you're from across the country. It's always fun when we do that. Feel a nice connection that way, even though I can't visit those places perhaps yet. It's nice to connect with people who are there. Great, we see it perfectly. So I'm going to mute myself now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, depending on if you're east or west of me, I guess, since we're at noon. But my name's Chris, and as Sarah mentioned, I do professionally mostly systematic and taxonomic work with moths, but I think moths are absolutely fascinating because they do so many amazing things, and they are a huge part of the diversity on this planet. And I hope that I can share a little bit of that with you, and that you will pass some of that on to other people that are keen on nature. So I think as naturalists, and certainly us as entomologists, we still have some work to do about the societal perception or the common perception of moths. I think when you probably ask the most, the average person on the street, what comes to mind when they hear the word moth, perhaps, the moth to the flame scenario comes to mind. But I think that there is a lot, well, I know that there is a lot more to them than that. And if you dig just a little bit deeper to investigate what a moth is, you will soon learn that they are part of the order Lepidoptera, and that in fact they make up the vast proportion of the order Lepidoptera, together with butterflies, which make up a smaller part. And as being part of Lepidoptera, these are one of the big 4 orders of insects that make up a huge diversity of organisms on the planet. And so really, even if we can convince the average person to think of the word diversity instead of the moth to the flame scenario, or something that raids your fine linens and eats your fine linens in your closet, then that's a huge win. So insect diversity is vast. About half of Earth's described organisms are insects, and part of that, a big chunk of that diversity is the order Lepidoptera, which are moths and butterflies. So if we look at sort of the relative diversity of moths, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that diversity is, and sort of visualizing what that really means. There's about 158,000 described species of Lepidoptera, but there's probably at least 3 times that many, so most of them still remain undescribed. So by comparison, there's about 10,000 species of birds and 6,000 mammal species globally. So, moth diversity is enormous. And as you can see in this pie chart here, butterflies are a small part of that order Lepidoptera. And essentially, they're just sort of, if you think of the Lepidoptera family tree, the butterflies are just one branch of that tree, whereas moths make up the vast majority of the rest of that family tree.
Chris, I'm going to interrupt you there for a second. Someone had a good point. I'm seeing on the screen at the very bottom in the middle there, you can hide that little white bar with the blue. I can't click it. I think it's on yours. Are you able to click the? Thank you. Perfect.
Is that better?
Thanks. Great. Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you. That's relatively new for me, so thanks for.
No problem. So in terms of diversities, it's always easier to imagine and bring to mind what's happening locally. So in across Canada, there's about 5,100 species of moth documented. Most of that diversity are what we call micromoths, or sort of very small moths. But moths that most commonly get observed belong to 2 or 3 different families or superfamilies. And I won't get into the details of that now, but the diversity that most of us see is really only the tip of the iceberg. And most places in populated parts of Canada are home to an average somewhere between 800 to 1,500 different moth species, within a 50-kilometer radius, excluding maybe agricultural areas and very highly urbanized areas. But if you're if you're in a relatively if you're in an area of natural habitat, then that moth total fauna is huge. And we don't really have detailed information on what all those moths do, how they spend their life, what their part is in the ecosystem. We're just kind of barely at the point where we have now a list of everything that's been recorded here. And another way to parse out all that diversity is just to group them by families. And you can see in the graph on the right that there are some large families, but in the dark blue on the lower right, there are 68 other families that aren't on this graph. So families, if you know sort of your hierarchical classification, that's a very deep phylogenetic difference or a deep evolutionary difference between all those different groups. So the diversity is not only very, very large, it's considerable. So just one more little thought exercise about moth diversity. So I've just picked some plates of moths here, and there's about, roughly just under 400 different species. And if each one of those is a different species, and I want to show you all of Canada's moths, I would need to show you 15 slides like this. Versus butterflies, I could fit, if they were this small, I could fit them all on this slide. And if you're going to summarize all that knowledge and dedicate just one written page to every moth species, you would need 5 gigantic volumes of books to deal with this. But unfortunately, we don't even know enough about most moths to write an entire page, and certainly the experts and the resources don't exist to do that, to summarize that kind of knowledge. But perhaps one day. Why are there so many moths? Understanding that is the starting point to that is just figuring out what moths are and what they do for a living. The diversity is not only the species rich, it's not just the number of species, but it's also linked to the morphology, the metamorphoses that moths undergo, which I'll talk about in a minute, and particularly what they do for a living, what they eat and where they live, and I'll spend some time talking about that. So Moth Morphology 101, if you know very little about moths, they're insects. They have 3 body parts, head, thorax, and abdomen. And the thorax is where, like other insects, they have 3 pairs of legs and 2 pairs of wings. And some of the special features, I guess, of moths are on the head, especially the what is often called the proboscis or the tongue, which is now referred to as the hostelum. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The word Lepidoptera is derived from 2 words, lepidos meaning scale and pteron meaning wing. And this is one of the special features of Lepidoptera. Their wings are covered with these, what are actually highly modified hairs, and they're shaped a little bit like the overlapping tiles on a cedar shake or on a tile roof. And it's these individual scales, you can see at the scale bar at the bottom there, that's 1/2 millimeter. So these scales are, often less than 1/2 millimeter long. And each one of these individual scales are different colors. And these individual scales comprise the color pattern of the wings of all Lepidoptera, moths included, but also butterflies. And this is one of the major evolutionary innovations of the Lepidoptera. And having these tiny modified hairs allows them to be different colors. So that's a very visual visual mode of their morphology. So you can see in the top right there, there's actually a moth hiding in that. It's cryptic on lichens. It's a Pharrelia species. So colored scales allow moths to be extremely cryptic, but they also can convey very different visual information. So for example, the Io moth in the bottom right, which uses this scare tactic to flash its underwings to imitate a would-be predator's eyes. And scales are also they're not only just visual modalities, they're also water repellent. That you can have highly modified scales that disseminate pheromones for chemical communication, and they also function in thermoregulation. Like if you think of Arctic alpine insects that are predominantly dark colored, they can warm up a lot faster in the sun. So scales are just one major evolutionary innovation that Lepidoptera have allowed them to become very successful. So the second feature I'll mention is what's now technically called a hostelum, or used to be called a proboscis or a tongue. It's not really a tongue or a proboscis. And it's not really even so much a drinking straw because the space inside the hostelum is actually very small and acts primarily by capillary action. But this is a very important feature of Lepidoptera because it allows uptake of fluids, primarily flower nectar, but also dissolved minerals, moisture. And so I'll spend a bit of time talking about the what having a hostelum has allowed Lepidoptera to do. I guess the most obvious one is butterflies on the flower, but the extreme of hostelum morphology is probably the sphinx moths, which have an extremely long hostelum. So here on the right, or sorry, on the left is Xanthopan morgani, which is a South African sphinx moth, and you can see in this specimen the hostelum has been uncurled to show you exactly how long that is. And this species has a really interesting history because Charles Darwin famously predicted when looking at the orchids illustrated on the right, he predicted that there would be a sphinx moth that would pollinate it because the only way to reach the nectar in the very long nectar tubes, nectar spurs of these orchids would be by an extremely long, thin tongue. And he predicted that it would be a sphinx moth. And it was some 20 years later that that sphinx moth was discovered. And at the time, this was quite sensational because the tongue length in this particular sphinx moth wasn't actually known at Darwin's time, and it wasn't known in really any other moths. But now that we know the tropical fauna a little bit better, this is not actually that unusually long of a tongue. And there are actually Canadian species that have maybe not a tongue this long, but they have similar tongue morphology. And so the orchid and the sphinx moth is sort of the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about moth pollination and moths as specialist pollinators. So in Canada, we have Platanthera orchids, many of which are specifically pollinated only by sphinx moths because they're the only insect that can reach into the bottom of the nectar spurs. And orchids have this unique pollen transfer structure called a pollinium, which attaches it when the moth comes in to take the nectar from the orchid, attaches itself to the eye of the moth. And you can see in this middle image from a study by Westwood and Barkowski, I've highlighted in yellow the pollinium from a Platanthera orchid that has attached itself to the eye of this sphinx moth. And then, of course, that sphinx moth will go on to visit more orchids, and sphinx moths are the only pollinators of a number of species of Platanthera. But as it turns out, orchids or sphinx moths are not the only orchid pollinators. We can look at moths that either moth specimens or even live moths, and orchid pollinia are very easy to see. So here's an owlet moth, sort of a mid-sized gray moth that looks rather nondescript, but as it turns out, these moths also have, for their body length, have very long hosteli and are able to pollinate orchids. But surprisingly, we know very little about moth pollination and even orchid pollination. And the reason for this is that most of this happens at night. When most people hear the term pollinators, they think of, bees on a flower, probably comes to mind first, butterflies if you're into pollinators, but what happens at night? Well, what we don't see, we don't know. So for the most part, the role of moths as pollinators is unknown, but we are now getting, better evidence that moths are indeed also pollinating moths, in some cases more so than other insects are, and not just these special cases of orchids that I've discussed. So one way of doing this, you can see on the left, in the left image here is a scanning electron microscope image of pollen on the rolled up proboscis of an owlet moth, of a sallow. So we know for sure that they're going to flowers, and they're probably pollinating some things more more than we know. The logical extension from that is, how prevalent is this? Are they pollinating crops? And the answer is, yeah, probably. So there's some neat studies showing now that, for example, this study in moths in India was, of apples in India, was showing that, moths are basically all over the apple flowers in the spring and are probably significant pollinators. And the same goes for blueberries. This was in Atlantic Canada, this study. Low bush blueberry probably benefits considerably from being pollinated by moths. But because it's difficult to observe and difficult to prove, we know very little about it. So we've talked about, or I've talked about, the adult moth, where we all know that caterpillars become moths and butterflies, and they don't have wings. And how does that happen? So, like all insects that go through complete metamorphosis, there's actually 4 different life stages. Egg, the egg hatches into a larva, and the larva goes through several instars or skin casts, where it grows to its mature size. It then pupates, and in the pupal stage, we have this complete biological reorganization of tissue into the adult form that hatches then. So I don't think it can be understated how dramatic metamorphosis is. It not only links 2 very different lifestyles within moths. So we have these winged creatures that can cover a lot of ground and are quite good at flying. And then we have caterpillars, which are exceptionally good at converting plant energy into animal energy. Like, we have these basically more or less sedentary plant consumers, and they're basically like distensible feeding machines, kind of like hydrostatic water balloons that have some hardened structures that provide the ability for them to move and to provide structure. And some caterpillars can increase their weight from the time that they hatch out of the egg to the time that they're ready to pupate. They can increase their weight 10,000-fold. And most of that weight gain happens during the last larval instar, during the last stage, which is generally confined to, somewhere between 5 and 10 days. So the very hungry caterpillar has its basis in fact, for sure. And their main charge is to eat and don't get eaten. So they're accumulating all this energy to grow and to turn into a moth and hopefully not get eaten along the way. But they do get eaten along the way, because most moths will lay hundreds of eggs, and on average, of course, only 2 of those will become adults. Otherwise, the planet would be completely overrun with moths. So being a caterpillar, when most people hear the word moth, they think of, the adult moth, but most of a moth's life cycle, or a considerable part of the moth's life cycle, is actually spent as a caterpillar. So all growing and most of the feeding happens in that stage. Not all moths have functional mouth parts, so some don't even feed as adults, and they just live off the fat stores, the energy stores that they accumulate as caterpillars. And moths are first and foremost plant feeders, so their ecology is very closely linked and co-evolved with the distribution, the biochemistry, the growth requirements of plants. And so that comes into play, but as you'll see in a minute, they're not always plant feeders. There's some odd exceptions that make moths so successful. The other exception to the moth lifestyle are pests. Perhaps some of the other, negative connotations that come to mind when people hear the word moths is that they're pests. They get into your closet, they eat your fine linens, they destroy crops. It's true. Some moths compete with us for food, and they're very good at what they do, so they become pests. But when you consider, for example, just the North American fauna, where we have over 13,000 species of moth, less than 1% of those are considered pests. And the vast majority of those, most of us will never see. So being a larva, I would just like to highlight some of the challenges that larvae or caterpillars undergo. So here's an example of one of the most commonly observed insects in North America. If you go by what's on iNaturalist. The banded woolly bear, which turns into the Isabella tiger moth. And not surprisingly, the vast majority of observations of the species are caterpillars. And that is because they're around for a long time and they don't have a very cryptic lifestyle. So for 9 months of the year, these guys truck around as larvae. They spend the winter as larvae, usually under brush or leaf litter. Often you can find them in the fall when you're leaf raking. And the adult part of their life cycle, like most moths, not all moths, but most moths, the adult stage is quite short-lived, and adults are around for maybe a couple of weeks at most. So really a nice example of how you can imagine that the evolution and the success of this species is shaped around how good it is at being a caterpillar. Somewhat different, but similar in that the immature stages are present for most of the year is a Pharrelia moth, for example, and these moths have an extremely tightly associated larval stage, the caterpillar stage, to when the new growth of conifers happens in the spring. So the adults are out for a couple of weeks, lay their eggs, caterpillars hatch, feed up, and then from July on until next early spring, these guys are pupae underground. And in Canada and most of the temperate part of the world, winter is a significant influence on the life cycle of moths, and well, of all insects. But since we're talking about moths, let's get into that a little bit. So where do they go in winter? About 40% of all moths go to ground in a pupa. Some pupate in other places, as we'll see in a minute, but largely they're pupae. And also surprisingly as larvae. So they will also hide in various places to either avoid freezing or, as in most cases, they can handle freezing. They undergo supercooling. So only a few spend the winter as eggs or adults. It's mostly as in the pupal stage and the larval stage. So top left, here's some underwing eggs. Underwings fly late in the season, lay their eggs deep in bark crevices. So those tiny eggs have no problem surviving -40 exposed to ambient temperatures on bark cracks. And here's our friend the woolly bear again. They're generally this picture is not indicative of what they usually do all winter. They don't run around on the snow. They're usually well insulated under the snow and hibernate among leaf litter. Middle bottom is one of the several sallow species that overwinter in the adult stage, but this is kind of the exception rather than the rule. Only about 2% Canadian species overwinter as adults. And bottom left, we have a Saturnid cocoon, a Cecropia moth cocoon, which you can often find attached to shrubs in the winter. So these are different strategies that not only temperature provides a main obstacle to overcome, but also predator avoidance. And you'll see a lot of, in the case of the Saturnid cocoons, you'll see a lot of them predated, ripped open by woodpeckers and chickadees. And larvae are not illustrated here, but also anything that's on the ground is susceptible to, most often during the winter, rodent predation. So lots of predation happening at all times of the year. So these are just a couple of the things that set Lepidoptera up to have a really large variety of life history strategies, and this coupling of very different lifestyles of a caterpillar with a dispersing aerial adult. What do caterpillars eat? So leaves for the most part, we know this, but there are many different strategies. Some moths can eat a large variety of different species. Some moths are extremely specialized. Here's an example of the Shinia florida, the Florida flower moth. And you can see on the right, here's a caterpillar eating the inflorescences and seed heads of evening primrose. And its color matches the tissue of the plant almost perfectly. You can generally, the way you see these is you see the feeding damage before you see the caterpillar, and it's sitting right there. And then the adult moths have this neat behavior of tucking themselves often into the heads of the primrose flower heads. And their coloration, although not quite visible here, the coloration of the senescing flowers, the dying flowers have pinkish shades, so they're actually very well camouflaged. And there are over 100 species of flower moths in North America, at least I think 40 of those in Canada. So it's an example of a very specialized lifestyle. For the most part, leaf caterpillars are folivores. They eat leaves. For some reason, the text has gone off here, but this is a white blotched prominent eating an oak leaf. And again, when caterpillars eat exposed leaves like this, they usually have a pattern and morphology that makes them very hard to see on leaves, although some caterpillars are also aposematic. They advertise that they can't be eaten. All right, so those are just some of the different things, some of the different tissues that moths eat. You can also imagine that how big you are dictates what you do for a living. So here's an extreme example of size variation just within one family, the family Eurybidae. The example I've illustrated here are tropical species, but you could come up with a very similar comparison of just Canadian species. So enormous size variation. And even the small moth in the left image is much bigger than this leatherwood leaf miner, which spends its entire life and its entire larval life sandwiched between the outer and inner layer of a leaf. You could see the larva is backlit through this leatherwood leaf there, and they form a blotch mine inside that leaf, and they inhabit, many of these leaf miners, just a single leaf for their entire larval existence. And there are literally hundreds of leaf miners that have a similar sort of life history strategy. So you can imagine that that's very different than, a very large moth, which can have a caterpillar, the size of your thumb, or even a small breakfast sausage. That's not an exaggeration. That the amount of plant tissue they go through really dictates how they live. Another life history strategy are plant borers, so living inside plant stems. This is the iris borer, an owlet moth, and they spend their entire larval life eating the roots and lower stems of irises. And you can see some of the dieback on this wild iris on the right there. We have semi-aquatic moths. Here's one of my study organisms, the black-tailed diver, and they live submerged in water lily stems in the water, and they truck up and down inside the tunnels in the leaf petioles, and that is virtually their entire life cycle. Then they emerge out of the stem on top of the leaf and, of course, turn into a moth, which can then disperse to other water bodies. So virtually every type of plant tissue is exploited by at least some moths. Moving away from plant tissue, we also have several groups of moths that are lichen specialists. The lichen moths are first and foremost among those, but there are also other groups of moths that are lichen specialists. Lichens pretty much anywhere, on rocks, on wood, on virtually any substrate. That lifestyle really goes crazy as you go further south in the tropics, but we do have, I would say at least a dozen species in Canada that are lichen specialists. But it doesn't stop there. Virtually any plant matter has some moths that will feed on it. Fungi, leaf litter, rotting wood, all have examples of caterpillars that are able to eat those. Unusual diets. There are other moths that will eat other bizarre things. On the right is the common bagworm, which you can, in most parts of Canada, you can probably find attached to the siding of your house because they build these odd little cases, and the larva grazes algae and lichens from the side of just about any surface. Both of these species are introduced from Europe, by the way. The one on the left probably does some harm. It's the bee moth, and they eat virtually anything inside bumblebee or bumblebee cavities or even beehives. They will eat wax, pollen, eggs and larvae of bees, and they can be quite destructive. This was a mass emergence out of a birdhouse that I had up. The chickadees were in it 1 year, then the bumblebees moved in, and then the bee moths moved in and ate everything inside of it. And interestingly enough, it wasn't occupied since, but I've since cleaned it out, so maybe that will make a difference. So as you can imagine, when you have that many different caterpillars doing that many different things, it's not surprising that caterpillars account for most of the above ground biomass of invertebrates in most terrestrial ecosystems. And as such, they become important prey items and have other important ecosystem functions, for example, in decomposition, nutrient cycling. These are all things that are integral parts of most terrestrial ecosystems. Here's a nice example of just one type of songbird that relies almost entirely on caterpillars to raise its young. Probably 80–90% of the nesting diet of black-capped chickadees is caterpillars. And I would say the same is true of most songbirds. Not all songbirds. Some are aerial insectivores, but those birds gathering caterpillars, they tend to have the vast majority of their diet that they're raising their young with is caterpillars. Here's a nice example of a leaf litter moth, and it's left this really amazing little lace-like oak leaf behind as it grazes in between the leaf veins. And there's an entire fauna of moths that eats basically leaf litter or dead plant tissue on the ground. Okay, so that's the end of sort of what moths do. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what people can do for moths now that I've convinced you that moths are amazing. Like a lot of insects, moths are almost certainly in decline. We don't have a lot of hard data on that, but there was a paper that just came out for butterflies in the US showing a really alarming decline in butterflies. And because butterflies have, their ecology is basically just a subset of what moths do. So it would be very much expected that a decline in moths is also occurring. And the causes for this is, it's our fault. And there are, it's probably a number of different things acting together because we see the greatest declines in areas that have the greatest human impact. Insecticides has been shown to be causative in butterfly declines, habitat loss and fragmentation, pollution, invasive plants and insects, climate change. All these things are affecting a decline in not just moths, but in other insects. So because most of us live in cities, let's talk about the urban environment. For most moths, to sum it up, there's no place to hide and there's nothing to eat in most urban environments. We have a lot of sealed surfaces, so pavement and concrete, highly manicured landscapes such as parks and lawns. And really moths need leaf litter, brush piles, dead wood. They need a habitat heterogeneity to be able to survive. So all the things that we do in cities are really hard on moths. But it's not all bad news. We as individuals can do stuff. People who have gardens, and even people who don't have yards or gardens that they can tend, there are still things that individuals can do. And I've put Doug Tallamy's book here because this is probably, it is a great place to get started if you're at all interested in this. If you haven't looked at this book already, it's packs so much information in, and it's, even though it's most relevant to Eastern Canada, the take-home messages and the guidelines are applicable across the board. So insects need just four, you can sort of think of four different things that insects need. They need refugia, places to hide from temperature extremes, moisture extremes, and predators and pathogens. And they need enough food. A lot of them need access to water. Moths, that's perhaps a little less critical. And not surprisingly, they don't like pesticides. So there are actually some very simple solutions that you can do with gardening and landscaping in mind. I think first and foremost, the most important thing is just to increase the number of native plants that we use in our gardening and landscaping. We really need to have this paradigm shift of coming away from ornamental plants that were marketed as pest-free, because that really means they're insect-free, and the insects are suffering as a consequence of that. So really increasing the number of native plants that we use, not only in gardens, but in parks and any public spaces, is going to be key to making any difference. Exposed soil versus sealed surfaces, I've mentioned a bit already. Reduce manicured lawns and minimize mowing. Lawns are a pretty tough place to make a living for most insects, unless you like pests like Japanese beetles. They love them. And just adding structural complexity. If you have the privilege of having a yard big enough for a small brush pile or even a small compost pile, those places are full of insects, and in a good way. And of course, synthetic chemicals are detrimental. So leave some leaves. Perhaps you've heard of these initiatives to not rake all the leaves off your property in the fall. Leave some shelter, because as I mentioned earlier, when in talking about how moths spend their winter, they need some cover. They can't hide on your lawn. They can't hide on the concrete. So they need a little bit of leaf cover, a little bit of dead plant cover to make it through the winter. And the other thing that goes hand in hand with that is leaving some dead plant stems, because a lot of insects spend the winter inside plant stems. So here's a really good example of that. One of the gall-producing moths in a goldenrod. And even if the moth or the pupa may not be in there over the winter, there will be other insects that use that structure secondarily. If you ever crack open, large plant stalks in winter, you can often find insects hunkered down in there spending the winter. So all that structural complexity and that leaf litter is very important. And you don't have to leave your entire yard covered in leaves. You can, if everybody dedicated a small space to that, it would make a huge difference. And as I've mentioned, planting native plants is for moths and all other plant-feeding insects. This really is critical. These moths have evolved over thousands, some over millions of years, to be specially adapted to the plants that they eat, and they can't make a go of it on your hostas. They need native plants that occur naturally in the environment that you're in. And just starting small is enough. You don't have to convert your entire yard into a wildlife, into pristine wilderness. All it takes is to start with a few native plants. Choosing what to plant. Now, this is I'm going to be talking just a little bit general here, because it really depends on where you live. I'm based in Eastern Ontario, where we are lucky to have a quite high diversity of deciduous trees and shrubs, which are really very important for moths. But the same guidelines apply to anywhere in Canada. If you don't have oaks, there are other plants that have a very high value compared to some of the other native plants. And oaks really are amazing. If you live in an area that has where native oaks occur and you have enough space to plant an oak tree, there are over 900 species of Lepidoptera across North America that feed on oaks. And the same can't be said about any other tree species, although a number come very close. So cherries are probably a close second. Any of the native prunus, poplars and willows are too. Birch as well, pines, ash, basswood, maple. So that's getting a little bit more into the the deciduous zone if you don't live where those things are native. But poplars, willows, and birches and cherries are native across Canada. And together, those genera that I've mentioned, plus about 10 others, host about 80% of the Lepidopteran species of eastern deciduous forests. So just really important to plant native. And along that same vein, avoid planting cultivars or species that are not native to your region. Flowering shrubs, again, it's depends on where you live, but in general, anything in the rose family are incredible hosts for many different insects. The image of the beetles is of one of my dogwoods, and every year I am amazed by the number of different insects that are visiting those flowers when they're flowering. And flowering shrubs are kind of a two for the price of one, because you have a pollinator resource, and you can have a resource for plant feeding moths or caterpillars that eat these. And again, the rose family, a ton of species eat different species in the rose family, but also dogwoods, New Jersey tea, which is ceanothus, viburnums, elderberries, blueberries, basically virtually any flowering shrub. If you can find some space for those, they're incredibly diverse. Perennials gets a little bit more tricky regionally, because whether you're in the prairies or the eastern deciduous forest, it's going to really depend on what is native in your area and what you can plant in your yard. But generally, I would say that if you can plant some species from the aster, the legume, and the mint families and select for flowering times that cover off the season, you're not going to go wrong. And other high value things that sometimes get overlooked are native tall grasses. There are actually a lot of different insects that are graminivores that eat only grass, and so tall, native, and of course unmowed grasses would be are very important. And just to give you an example of one species here, I could have done a similar slide with Canada goldenrod, but it tends to be a bit more aggressive when it spreads in your yard, as I have found out. Evening primrose will grow just about anywhere, and in fact, the more you neglect them, it seems that the better they grow. And they're like insect condos. There are so many, like I'm just showing you moths here, but there are so many insects that benefit from evening primrose. So the Florida flower moth, top center, I've mentioned that one before. Atroposia is its top left. That's another beautiful, quite small moth that I think feeds on the seed pods. And then in the middle, the Aristotelia, that is a leaf miner in the leaves of primrose, as is the Mompha at the bottom there. And if that's not enough for you, the birds, like the goldfinch on the far left there, they love the overwintering seed capsules as well. Invasive plants, again, it depends on where you are in the country, but for us in Eastern Ontario and Western Quebec, the European buckthorn is probably one of the most environmentally destructive ones, because it will move into wetlands and completely outcompete all the other native plants and shrubs. And there are a few moths that will eat leaves of European buckthorn, but pales in comparison to the shrubs that would be growing there if it hadn't taken over. Lastly, if you plant it, they will come. This is one thing that, even though as a trained entomologist, I kind of expected, I'm still amazed at the number of things that show up in my yard years after I've planted things. So last fall, the caterpillars of the sphinx moth showed up on my they were on one of the wild cherries I had planted a few years ago, and they were on a chair or they were on a bush overhanging one of my lawn chairs in the backyard, and they were literally in front of my face, and I had missed them all summer, and there they were. There were several of them. So moths are very good at finding these resources. They fly, so they can get around. And just to re-stress that everyone can play a role through doing some of these small actions. Even if people couldn't plant native plants, if you left a patch of lawn and didn't mow it, that would be better than, mowing it, or better than concrete. It actually, doing things that are beneficial to moths and other insects takes, the most simple things take virtually no effort. And all those little things can make a huge difference. So I would like to thank all the INAT contributors for their fabulous images that I've borrowed. And yeah, there's this, I don't imagine you'll be able to jot these down, but I will leave up these resources in the talk that you can link to, because I think probably the most challenging thing for most people will be to figure out what, if you're going to do this, is figuring out what to plant, and depending on where you're at. So thank you.
Well, thank you. That was fantastic. You have packed so much information in this time together so clearly with beautiful slides, and very empowering. I love so much of what you say. It's what we say here as well. Any little thing you can do is going to make a difference. And oftentimes it is very simple, but just do it. So, and you've helped people be informed with that as well. So that's super. Before we get into questions, I just have a couple of things I want to share. People, I think I saw in the chat, someone was asking again, perhaps you were a latecomer, about replay. There will be a follow-up email for this with a replay link. So that will take a few days as soon as I get the time to do that, and the video is ready. So watch for that. And for those who may not know about what iNat or iNaturalist is, it is a wonderful platform. It's a citizen scientist tool where, and I'll include a link for that too also in the follow-up email, where people can upload their pictures, and it can help scientists discover, oh, this creature was discovered here, we've never seen it there before. They can monitor populations, you can get photos identified, you can learn stuff online. It's a really great, neat way to come together. And a colleague of mine asked me actually to point out that there is National Moth Week at the end of July, and on a Naturalist will create a project for that. So if you want to participate, stay tuned. I'll include a link for that, where you can take pictures of all the moths you see that week and help us learn that way. I think those are the main things I wanted to say before we get into the questions now, because there are a lot. So let's get going. Oh, and Derek, I saw in the chat that you were there from England. That's awesome, and you're mentioning that in the Q&A. Yeah, that's so cool. People from far and wide. I love it. Really great. Let's see here. Philip asks, what ecological role is filled by the multi-plumed moths, which are my winter companions? I think they come in with the firewood.
Yeah, so they're one of the kind of that small proportion. I think it was 2% of moths that overwinter as adults, and so you will get moths often showing up in houses when people bring firewood in, and their ecological role. I know what they feed on. They feed on things in the honeysuckle family. Lonicera, I think, is twining honeysuckle is one of their hosts. But again, it's a great example of a really cool moth that we don't really know a lot about, other than what their larvae eat, and are they pollinating things? Who knows? I showed that SEM of the moth proboscis with the pollen on it. It would be really cool to look at some plume moth proboscis, some hostelli, and see if there's pollen on them. I have no idea what they do, and probably there's no one that does. Perhaps there might be some elucidae in Europe where the biology of them is better known. So that's one thing I sometimes do, is if There's a big mystery in terms of local species biology. Sometimes there's a related species in Europe where they've had longer to accumulate knowledge, and sometimes there's important clues there.
So much to keep discovering in life, isn't there?
Mhm.
And Esther asks, please do talk about hummingbird moths. And I was even going to sort of say, oftentimes when I'm encouraging people to leave leaves under the tree, I use them as an example in terms of, and again, I'd love for you to tell us more. How many moths do this in terms of, like, for instance, finishing their metamorphosis? They cling to the leaves fall to the ground. They finish their metamorphosis in the leaf litter. They overwinter until it's warm enough. In the spring, like they say, 10 degrees night and day kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about hummingbird clearing moths? They're the ones, I think that's one in our
Yeah,
poster
for
right here.
sure. So they're actually one of they're kind of the how do you say, like the public ambassadors for moths, because they're day flying. So those are the moths that probably get noticed the most, And yeah, I mean, I talked about the specialization, what wing scales allow moths to do. And here's a group of moths that have basically they get rid of their wing scales. They emerge from their pupa fully scaled, these hummingbird moths. And on their first flight, most of those scales fall off, so they can look like a bumblebee. And it's just another extreme of that. But yeah, they're very important diurnal pollinators. Whether or not they're more important than other sphinx moths or other moths, we don't really know, because we don't know what's going on at night. But certainly, they're a very prominent pollinator, and yeah, they're very cool to have in the yard. And that's actually one of the ones that I planted some viburnum, and they actually, one of the slides I showed was from my yard. So if you plant some viburnums, you'll probably get their caterpillars. But
Yeah, they're always exciting to see. It's like, oh my gosh, what was that? And they're very quick. And yeah, I know in my garden, I have not seen them as larvae, but I've seen them as adults, and they go to my wild bergamot. They love that. It's just so
yes,
many other pollinators. But
yeah, they love
someone saying,
the mints. They love
pardon?
the mint, any plant in the mint family they love. So if you want more
Okay.
in your yard, plant bergamots or any other mints. And actually, iNaturalist is a great place to figure out what is attracting what in terms of flowers and moths locally. So just pull up the hummingbird moth observations for the area that you're in, and you'll get a good sense of what flowers they like going to.
That's a very, very good idea. Yeah. Someone saying here in Cranbrook, BC, last year they sprayed for gypsy or sphinx moths as pests. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the forest pests, they tend to be sprayed with BTK, which is a bacillus. It's a bacteria, and the conventional wisdom and the research on that is that it is very specific to just one type of caterpillar, and there's sort of mixed results in terms of the negative impact it has on non-target moths. Some studies show that it does impact other moths, and some other studies show that it has no effect. So the jury's still kind of out on whether whether spraying for forest pests has a negative impact on everything else. But pardon me. So the jury is still out on that. But I guess the question is, at what point do we risk harming non-targets at the expense of controlling that pest?
Okay, thank you. And then someone's asking, how do Cecropia moth pupa survive while attached to shrubs?
So the Cecropia cocoon is actually a really cool structure. It's a double-walled structure. So the pupa is inside the cocoon, and the cocoon itself is made of 2 layers of silk. And if you've ever played with a Cecropia cocoon, you'll realize it's like very, very tough paper. It's tougher than paper. You can't really rip it. And so that provides mechanical protection from birds. It's hard for birds to get into, although woodpeckers and chickadees do. It's very tough. And then that double-walled structure is kind of buffers it a little bit against extreme temperature fluctuations. And if you have the chance to look at a Cecropia cocoon, you'll see that at one end it's kind of pointed, and it's kind of like a one-way valve. And that's when the moth emerges from the pupa inside that cocoon, it will excrete a liquid to soften the silk around the exit of that cocoon, and it can force itself through that kind of that one-way opening, that one-way hole in the end of the cocoon. So they're actually very well designed.
Very cool. Yeah, gosh. And Sarah asks, if moth pollinating is important to flowers, they must have adapted to lure them to them. So what are flower adaptations to lure moths at night?
Right. Yeah. So great question. Some moths or some flowers, if you look at them, it's not hard to tell that they're moth pollinated, or at least not geared towards nocturnal insects, because they will open in the evening. They will open at the onset of night, and the evening primrose, as the name suggests, opens in the evening, and they actually close up in the morning. So these are very much flowers that are geared to nocturnal pollination, and we think that moths are a big part of that. So when the flowers open, that's a big clue. A lot of flowers will also be that open at night are white or very light colors. So that's another adaptation. If you think of petunias and tobacco flowers is another great example of nocturnal flowers. But even some things like asters that don't really have a daily rhythm of opening and closing, asters don't really seem to care. And as I showed in the one picture, they're definitely used by insects at night. But yeah, in general, plants that are geared specifically to moths will open at night and be brightly colored. And a lot of them have the fragrance is the chemistry of the fragrances is, and I don't recall the details exactly, but they basically smell better at night. So they're actually emitting these flower scents at night. So yeah, a lot
I
of
was going
plants.
to ask you, are they stronger at night, or do they simply smell at night and not perhaps during the day?
Yeah.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I can think of lots of examples in the tropics. There are examples, but fewer in temperate North America, but certainly there are.
Cool. Okay, so we've got a few more questions, and I know it's just gone one. Chris has kindly agreed to stay on a little bit longer if there was a lot of enthusiasm and questions, and there are, so we'll just try and get a few more in. And I am seeing people in the chat. If you do have to go, thank you very much for all the lovely comments and the enthusiasm and participation. It's always really nice. It helps make the experience great for everybody. So David asked, what was the term for advertising that they can't be eaten?
Aposematism, which
okay.
Yeah, basically means don't eat me, I'm poisonous. And a lot of the brightly colored moths are known or thought to fall into that category. So you can kind of broadly divide what a moth looks like into, is it really obvious and brightly colored, or does it look like, bark, or is it like really camouflaged on plant matter on the ground? And again, that's a pattern that is more pronounced in the tropical fauna, where you have a lot more aposematism, a lot more poisonous looking moths, but we do have our share in Canada as well, even though most of them tend to be camouflaged or cryptic.
Okay. Esther's asking if you can speak a bit about the sponge moths that caused a lot of tree leaf damage in Ottawa a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so the spongy moth is one of perhaps the most economically damaging pests that we've introduced into North America, and that was around the 1860s or 1870s. It was introduced from Europe, and since then, and still now, undergoes periodic outbreaks where the numbers get so high that they completely defoliate trees. And of course, when trees have no leaves, they can't photosynthesize, and occasionally they can kill the tree. And in forestry, of course, when trees grow less, that's less desirable. So yeah, I mean, it's an entire field of study in itself. They cause considerable economic damage, and we've also spent a lot of money on in controlling them. And there's also been collateral damage in trying to control them. There's a tachinid fly, a parasitoid, a fly that kills the larva that was introduced to try and control the gypsy moth. So another insect, try and control the introduced insect. But that, as it turns out, that fly also very much likes eating wild silk moths. So in the eastern US, it's been shown that fly has had at least a part in causing declines of some of the wild silk moths. So it's this whole, I guess, a field of economic entomology that's evolved around the introduction of the gypsy moth and what it's doing in North America. But generally speaking, the outbreaks will last a year or two and then decline, and then they'll be absent again for a number of years. But
That's
yeah,
interesting. Yeah. And I know in general, insects in general, so few bite, so few do damage that are really noticeable compared to how many more there are. And I think you alluded to that at the beginning of the presentation. And non-native invasive species aside, just the ones that are native. I remember seeing years ago some footage, like aerial footage of, well, they tried to show it in terms of aerial concepts in the Amazon somewhere, how some natural animal would deforest or leaf the trees in an area and go around. By the time it got finished the circle of that area that it was in and got back to the first tree had completely recovered. It's as if they had this balance. So it's all how it's so complicated, all these different relationships, excluding the non-native invasive ones. But
yeah,
yeah,
and that's actually a good point, that the re-leafing. A lot of trees can send out another or will send out another flush of leaves after they've all been eaten off. That's the trees that are best sort of adapted that seem to be aspen and some of the things that get defoliated by forest tent caterpillars, which are native. So that system seems to have sorted itself out, whereas it's less efficient, I would say, in the gypsy moth defoliation, just because that's not a dynamic that's evolved here.
yes, yeah. So I think we'll try and see if we can get a few more. Carolyn asked, I noticed some damage to Joe Pyeweed leaves similar to the photo of the leatherwood leaf miner. Is that caused by moth? If so, which type of moth, please?
The answer is maybe. There are, so moths are a big proportion of the leaf mining insect fauna, but there are also small flies that that have a similar kind of lifestyle. And I'm glad you brought up Joe Pyeweed, because that is another super condo as far as hosting insects goes. I mean, there's so many things that love Joe Pyeweed, and if it's something that you can plant in your yard, that's another great plant to have. And yeah, there are probably multiple species of different leaf miners that live in the leaves of Joe Pyeweed.
You said insect condos. I love that. Is that your term? Did you just make that up, or has that been around? Because I'm going to copy that.
I've probably heard that somewhere else before.
Okay. Otherwise, I'd credit you. But anyway, it's a fun term. Let's see. Allison asks, and it's a good question. Are mulched soil areas okay? And I know, again, I should say also, some mulch is dyed and undyed. I say go for the undyed, and some mulch is like the thick wood chips versus the finer mulch, which allow creatures and soil to move or water to move around through. But she says, does that provide usable unsealed areas for moths to access, or is it bad due to its processing and chemicals?
I mean, if it's unprocessed, it's probably okay. The species that need the exposed soil the most they're strong diggers, so they would have no problem dealing even with something like as large as wood chips. And I guess it also depends what kind of mulch you're using. I guess if you're using finer mulch like straw, is probably a little bit easier for a lot of insects to deal with, as opposed to wood chips. I myself, I like using leaf litter, but I didn't mention it in the talk, although I think I had it on the slide somewhere, is the earthworms eat it all. So as a lot of people probably know, like all earthworms are introduced, and they've actually started significantly altering the forest floor because they eat all the leaves. Like in my backyard, I rake everything into the ravine, and it's covered in leaves until June, and then I'm down the bare dirt because the
Mm.
worms have eaten everything. So if you don't have that cover there, so all that to say is, yeah, if any kind of mulch or any kind of ground cover is probably better than none, and certainly better than a sealed surface.
Okay, I'm going to add one little thing too. I learned from someone who's with a wild pollinator partner. She was saying to me how they were finding that the really big wood chips, though, for a lot of the solitary ground nesting bees, they are harder for them. So, like, I see people even have a mix, have some bare soil in with if you have
Yeah,
certain flower beds in some spots, but allow the leaves to fall and stay where they are where possible, and then some fine mulch here and there. So maybe even mix it up and see, try to mimic nature however you can in
yeah,
different spots, maybe.
absolutely. Yeah, I should say that I'm speaking only to moths, but yeah, I know that if you're considering
Which is relevant
ground,
here, of course.
ground nesting bees, yeah, certainly you need some bare dirt for sure.
Okay. If you had to choose one tree to plant in Southern Ontario for moth diversity, which would it be? I mean, you talked about oaks and being really
Yeah,
huge and the prunus and the
well,
willows, but
yeah. Well, I guess if I was only going to plant one tree, it would probably be an oak. Yeah,
okay.
and
Um,
something in the white oak group. So either white oak or bur oak or chinkapin or one of those.
and if you only have a small space and you can't actually plant a tree, like there are some species of willow that are smaller that can handle being in a garden, I think too, aren't they?
Mhm.
Um, that could work too. Um, what are good ways to attract moths for observation without harming them? It's a good question.
I guess if you're thinking, adult moths, then the pollinator strategies is probably the way to go. Hummingbird moths are probably the easiest to attract with things like, bergamot or other flowers that they're attracted to. In terms of like if you're thinking you want to attract caterpillars, if you want to have some plant that has caterpillars on it, that's, it's going to be a little bit more hit and miss. Like you'll have caterpillars some years and not others. But if you have the room to plant a shrub, then any of the flowering shrubs in the rose family would probably be have the highest chance of getting something on it. But if you're just interested in observing adult moths, then the flower slash pollinator strategy is probably your best bet.
Okay, great. And I know you raised some really good points in the talk, but Carolyn's wondering, like, what would be the easiest thing to say to the average person who knows little about native plants and the insect world? Why are moths so important? Do you have any little go-to phrases that you like to use with people, or?
Um, it's because moths are so diverse and do so many different things. It's hard to hard to do just one thing. But the one thing I always say, because a lot of like even kids can relate to what a butterfly is, and that it's important to have one of those. Well, then I often tell kids is that butterflies are just moths that are scared of the dark, because they do the same things.
Fun. Okay, thank you. Okay, we just have three more, I think that I can, or four more. Let's see if we can get through them quickly. When is it appropriate to put live traps out in central Ontario?
Appropriate in terms of timing. I mean,
Well,
really any time from snow melt to when the snow flies. The highest diversity and the highest abundance of moths tends to be from sort of late June to early July, and that sort of coincides with when National Moth Week is. I believe that's in early July, because that is when the highest diversity of species and the highest abundances are happening.
okay, someone's saying, so if moths live mainly as larvae and pupa, their role in pollinating flowers isn't that big, correct? Hmm.
If you're remembering that, all pupae and all larvae, all caterpillars turn into moths, and the majority of those have that hostellum, that little rolled up proboscis straw job that they're using to get flower nectar for the most part. Not all moths do, but that moths especially evolved to take nectar from flowers. So, I realizing that um, imbibing nectar is not necessarily the same as pollinating, because they may be not very good pollinators. Some species might just be, stopping for a drink or to refuel. But every moth is an adult at some stage, and the vast majority of those will visit flowers.
Thank you. So I think we need to wrap it up now. Let's see how many questions we had to ignore. Let's see. I think we've got through most of them. Someone's just asking, town of Oakville sprayed extensively against invasion of the gypsy moths in our ravines to ward off damage to the oak trees. Is this type of action avoidable? Like, I guess she's wondering if there are any other steps one could do before then, or
yeah, it's a tough one. If it's a small enough local area, things that can work is to put burlap straps around trees, like overlapping burlap straps, where because the larvae like to hide under there, and you can manually pick off larvae and dispose of them. But you can't do that in a forest. You could do it to a few trees, but yeah, I guess yeah, it's a tough one, and it's not an answer that people have come up with, in nearly 100 years of trying to control this moth.
Okay, well, one last sort of tricky question, but then we're going to wrap it up, because this has been absolutely fabulous and people have been sharing some wonderful comments. So I'm really grateful people have been participating and enjoying this too. And so Chris, one last question. There are only 100 pest moths. Are they economically important as pests? What is used for control of them? BTK?
Right. Yeah, so some are and some aren't. I put everything under quite a large umbrella there. Like it's a little bit difficult to define, what is a pest? Is a pest something that eats what I'm going to eat, or is a pest something that costs farmers millions of dollars to spray for? And the truth is that those are the extremes and everything in between. So that 100 species was, it's a ballpark figure, but it includes a wide range of things. And we've talked about the gypsy moth, or the what is now called the spongy moth, and that is that is certainly one of the biggest forestry pests. There are other species that are more, or at least as important, in agricultural systems. So diamondback moth is probably the largest agricultural pest in Canada, and that is not something that can be easily dealt with, because we rely on such a huge quantity of crops that the diamondback moth likes to eat. So I guess the answer is, it really depends.
Thank you. And so great questions, people, and awesome information, Chris. I really, really appreciate this, and so many people have enjoyed it as well. So thank you. And I wish you all a fantastic rest of the day. And hopefully you can check out some of the links on the screen now, but I'll also include many in the follow-up email where you can get ideas of what you can do in your own outdoor spaces, whether you have your own property or whether it's a community park, etc., and to go exploring and discovering and share on iNaturalist, etc. So watch out for that email in a few days' time. And yeah, thank you. This is great. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for organizing this, Sarah, and thank you everyone for viewing.
Great. Have a good one. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.